Kia ora koutou. I'm Sarah Bell, Project Lead at the Helen Clark Foundation. Welcome to today's webinar on productivity, inequality and prosperity over the long term. Before we get started, just a few quick notes from me. This is the second webinar in our Facing Up to Our Future series, launched alongside the book of the same name, which is edited by Peter Davis. The book's available for pre-order now. My colleague will drop a purchase link in the chat shortly. And our Helen Clark Foundation members get $15 off with a code that was sent through to you on the 26th of June if you haven't redeemed that already. This month, we've got a really exciting lineup of our four Facing Up to Our Future webinars. Our next one in the series is on Thursday, the 23rd at 12 p.m, featuring Peter Bale, Professor Jemima Tiatiasiao, Professor Stuart McNaughton, and Professor Robin Gould talking about health, education, and Pacific futures for New Zealand. If you're not already a member of the Foundation, we'd love to have your support as we grow our independent, non-partisan and evidence-based think tank. Membership is affordable and takes only a couple of minutes to set up through the link that Victoria's popped in the chat. And we've got an exciting promo for new members joining us this month. So if you're interested, please have a look at the website. Finally, as we always say in our webinars, please be assured that your cameras and microphones are turned off for the duration of the webinar so nobody can see or hear you and you can safely eat your lunch. We would love for everyone to participate in the webinar today though, and the best way to do that is to pop questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can do that whenever you think of a question during the webinar, and if we have time, hopefully Fran will put some of those questions to our panel towards the end of the conversation. There's also a chat function which you'll see at the bottom of the screen. You're welcome to engage with each other in there, but if you've got questions you'd like to go to the panel, please make sure you put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And we've asked our panelists to be as brief as they can with their responses to Fran's questions, just to help us make sure that we've got time for some of your questions at the end. We're thrilled to have Fran joining us to moderate today, and I'm going to hand over to her now to get started. Thank you, Fran.
Thank you very much. And what a timely conversation to be having. Election year, fiscal issues, perennial. And I think this is a very interesting way of getting some focus on what matters. In the preamble to this, we're talking about how New Zealand's economic debate tends to circle back to the same two assumptions, that if we only had more money or more clever ideas, the problems would be solved. Today's panellists ask us to look elsewhere across fiscal policy, competition, industrial strategy, investment and skills. And they're arguing that the real constraints around design, they're around institutions and accountability, and whether we can hold a course long enough for reforms to work. Very timely in a 3-year election cycle. We want to ask our panellists to help us to think about the long game. What are the structural choices in front of us? What would it take to make good decisions? And those that actually go beyond a single electoral cycle. We're fortunate to have 5 contributors to Facing Up to Our Future, Challenges and Choices for New Zealand with us today. Matt Nolan, E61 Institute on Fiscal Sustainability and the Case for an Independent Fiscal Institution. Toby Moore from Victoria University on Industrial Policy for a Small Open Economy. Tim Maloney from the University of Auckland on Competition, Infrastructure, Investment and also Welfare. Jon Duffy, a consumer advocate on markets that have stopped working for New Zealanders, and Michael Johnston from the New Zealand Initiative on Vocational Learning and School-to-Work Transition. Welcome to you all. We've got a lot to get through and only 1 hour, so I'll keep my questions tight and leave time, hopefully, at the end of the session for questions from the audience. Round 1, the diagnosis. If we can start with you, Matt, your chapter pushes back on the usual underperformance story. Measured by real net disposable income, New Zealand actually looks materially stronger than headline GDP suggests, and we outperform the OECD on particular averages like life satisfaction, environment and institutional trust. Yet you argue that the current fiscal track is unsustainable, with Treasury projecting health and aged care costs rising sharply as the population aged 75 and over doubles over the next 4 decades. You say what's missing is not policy ideas, but institutional capacity to weigh the trade-offs honestly, and you call for a fiscal institution. Can you set out that paradox for us and explain what such an institution would actually do that we can't do now?
Sure thing. Thank you, Fran. So when I was asked to write this chapter, I was told to give a sort of background for all the other excellent chapters that come after it. And the idea here was to outline the fiscal situation through the macroeconomic environment. And one thing I noticed when I was going through how New Zealanders tend to be writing about the macro environment is it's incredibly negative when New Zealand is actually a wonderful country, has performed very well. So if we measure incomes properly, if we take into account we don't have much capital and so we don't have to pay for the depreciation of that, if we take into account the fact that people are paying more for our products than they used to, and if we take into account the way that external fiscal position, financial positions have improved, we've got about 0.4% income growth per year more than we often say we do, looking at GDP per capita. And that doesn't sound like much, but over 20 years, that's 8 to 9% additional income. And when you look at that, New Zealand starts to look quite strong. So we have a good fiscal environment for developing growth, even though we're a distant country that struggles. We compare ourselves with Australia all the time, and that comparison is a bit unfair. Now, given that, Treasury and IRD, I'll note as well, have done a lot of good work outlining what's going to happen with aging and how we'll think about paying those bills. So we have public institutions that put that information out in public and describe the risk of aging. Now, the fact New Zealand has done well does not rule out that aging is a problem. And the Retirement Commission as well has done a great job on that. But then when we look at solutions, there's a lot of public debate and costings that don't necessarily add up. And I'd argue that we have an institutional structure relying on Treasury, relying on the Retirement Commission that doesn't have full independence from government to do costings in a way that public will buy into. And so I asked myself, what do I see in Australia that has led to better policy around aging, even though their public service is more politicized, even though the media environment is much, much more toxic. And it's a parliamentary budget office. They have an independent office that's able to talk about medium-term sustainability, that's trusted by the public, that can do costings for people, and that will disagree with the government, not in a way to pick a fight, but because it's objective and it provides objective information. They've improved the debate about aging, and they've improved how Australia makes policy in that sense. And it feels like New Zealand could benefit from that.
Yeah, and that's certainly a debate that has been circling for some time. Moving to you, Toby, you've made the provocative claim that New Zealand's been practicing industrial policy for decades. Film subsidies, agriculture's ETS exemption, provincial growth fund. We don't label it as such. You argue the task is to do deliberately and transparently rather than by accident, and with robust evaluations and real attention to how incumbents are capturing policy. Can you explain what a well-designed industrial policy would look like for a small open economy? And how do we even attempt it at the moment when the rules-based order is fraying and US-China competition is reshaping the landscape around semiconductors, AI and green tech?
Yeah, kia ora, everyone. Thank you, Fran. I'll just explain to begin with why that might be a provocative claim. So when I talk about industrial policy, we're really talking about policies that are aimed at some sort of transformation of the structure of our economy towards some particular objective. For a long time, this has been an unfashionable view. The paradigm we've been working in for a long time has put a lot more emphasis on markets and has tended to be skeptical of the view that the government has too much of a useful role to play beyond providing basic public goods. My argument is we should be rethinking whether industrial policy can help us achieve the sort of economy that we want to see. As you noted, Fran, I think we have had policies over recent decades that have tilted the playing field towards certain sectors. And my concern is that we do that in a way that we don't often talk about that as a form of industrial policy. I think we would make a lot better decisions. We would get a lot more sort of robustness in our policies and the way that Matt's talking about if we had more open discussions about what we're trying to achieve here. As you note, the international environment for doing these sorts of policies is quite a difficult one. I would characterize this as, across two successive US administrations, we've seen both the good sides and the bad sides of industrial policy. The Biden administration was very, very ambitious in what they wanted to achieve here. That was directed at, climate transformation, emissions reduction, trying to provide jobs for the middle class, et cetera. the reason people often don't like industrial policy is a lot of the characteristics of that we see with the Trump administration. You know, protectionism, competition with China, deals being made based on relationships with people in the White House, and that's sort of the double-edged sword of industrial policy. I think in terms of how New Zealand should go about this, first of all, withdrawal from the global system is really not an option for us. There's no way in which New Zealand is going to be able to provide everything we demand for our people ourselves. So we need to continue to engage with the global system. I think a really good targeted industrial policy for a small economy would be really clear about the areas that we're focused on. David Skilling had a really good quote that I like to go back to about sub-therapeutic doses of industrial policy that we've engaged in previously. We do a lot of small things, but probably not enough big things to make a real difference. And we also need to be clear about the sort of state capacity that's required here. Industrial policy is hard. It's something that we need to get better at. It's something that we can learn from when it goes wrong. But I think the key thing is being open about what we're trying to achieve.
Thank you for that. Moving to you, Tim. I mean, your chapter ranges across competition, infrastructure, FDI, and welfare. And you've landed on a single diagnosis that the binding constraint is really money, it's poor design, and weak accountability. You argue the Commerce Commission needs power to enforce structural remedies, which are that infrastructure decisions need to be more independent and non-partisan, that we could be more welcoming to foreign investment, as small economies like Ireland are, and that welfare's real problem is complexity and not culture. Can you actually draw out that common thread for us?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Thanks, Fran. Well, I was asked at the outset to consider some microeconomic policy settings that might be used to achieve better economic outcomes. So as an economist, I decided to go to the literature to look at the World Bank, OECD, IMF analysis of New Zealand. And the four policies that really kind of stuck out for me are some fundamental drivers of economic growth and prosperity. And those are competition policy, infrastructure spending, foreign direct investment, and probably more surprisingly, social welfare. So these are things that people often look to as policy areas that are sort of essential to prosperity and economic growth. I just, at the outset, I should say that I am very supportive of the economic fundamentals in New Zealand. We have sound monetary and fiscal policy. We have a very good, efficient public sector. There are lots of things that are great about this country. But I think we need to shake things up a bit. And I think we need to kind of re-energize and redirect some parts of our economic system. So these are the four things that I thought were really fundamental and would be easily achievable. And if we look at these things, if they're done well, they can lead to higher productivity growth, better economic outcomes. If they're not done well, we are going to continue to see relatively slow economic growth and a relative decline in this economy compared to lots of other developed economies.
Thank you. Just following on from that, Jon, your chapter's blunt about markets that have stopped working for consumers, and the supermarket sector in particular, a $30 billion industry, has been found by the Commerce Commission to generate excessive profits. Residential electricity prices last year were 60% higher in real terms than the original Bradford reforms. And it goes on. 1 in 5 New Zealanders went without food last year. You argue our existing competition law is built to prevent emerging problems, but not to deal with entrenched market power. And Parliament keeps on choosing incrementalism. Can you explain why the usual tools fall short and what structural intervention actually means in practice?
Sure, and kia ora koutou. I'll do my best to stick to time. I'm a consumer advocate, so I have approached the question of market failure from a consumer lens. And in the chapter, I focused on the two critical markets that Fran has mentioned, electricity and supermarkets. But there are plenty more. But these, of course, are the markets that feature the most in the market research we do at Consumer NZ, and also as having a disproportionate impact on the lives of an increasing number of New Zealanders. Other markets like banking or insurance, aviation, building products, they could all have usefully been included in a broader analysis. And while there are commonalities in the ways each of these markets is arguably failing to deliver good outcomes for consumers, it's important to note at the outset that my argument's not that each of these markets is a complete failure. But in each of the markets that I mentioned, there are features that are producing negative outcomes for consumers. And in some cases, such as supermarkets and electricity, negative outcomes for some suppliers and independent power retailers as well. And those outcomes, of course, include things like high prices, limited and declining choice, low levels of innovation, the ability to exercise market power, build moats, and extract rents, as well as over-collect personal information where there's limited value offered back to the consumer. Not every market I listed above has all of these features, but many, the fact that many have at least one is pretty bad. So to actually answer the question, why are the usual tools failing to prevent entrenched market power? In my view, the first part of the answer is that Section 36 of the Commerce Act remains too narrow and too difficult to apply. It's hard for conduct to have the effect or likely effect of substantially lessening competition in markets like groceries, where actually competition between the players is anemic to start with. It's pretty much already as bad as it gets. So, in other words, kind of conduct that sees a firm make excessive profits on essential food items while paying suppliers so little that those firms actually go out of business, or producing windfall profits on power generated through hydroelectric assets, for example, just because some gas was burnt in the generation mix that day. They won't trigger Part 2 of the Commerce Act, including Section 36. They are more the result of entrenched structural features of those markets. And the second part of the answer relates to our merger laws. And there's kind of two problems here, just quickly, in my view. I mean, it's relatively settled that our merger regime has proven too lenient historically to prevent what are now widely regarded as harmful mergers. Recent amendments have sought to address this, but I don't think they quite get the whole way. And secondly, the merger regime has suffered from a lack of enforcement in terms of post-merger investigations, which are admittedly really tricky and expensive to undertake, but can't really address issues of market power that may not be apparent until well after the merger is completed and the market's adjusted around new central forces. I think I can leave it there and we'll get on to what structural interventions could look like in the later discussion.
Okay, thank you for that. And finally, Michael, your chapter takes on a long-standing bias towards university study over industrial training. Of 64,000 school leavers in 2024, 31% enrolled in university degrees, but only 6% went into apprenticeships, and 13% of recent students left within 18 months without a qualification. You focus on the new qualifications replacing NCEA from 2029, and you have one central design requirement, and that's industry-led subjects must carry identical grades and reporting to academic ones. Why is this parity important, and what happens if we get this wrong?
Well, we've got it wrong before, and we've got it wrong for a long time. It's worth thinking about what happened when NCEA was introduced, which had parity of esteem for industry training and vocational pathways as a goal, but it completely failed to deliver it because it didn't grapple with the underlying cultural issue, which is that we just have undue esteem for university degrees compared with other qualifications in industry training. So to get it right, what I'm saying is that we have to make sure that the grades on offer for industry-led subjects are the same as those for, university track or university subjects derived from university disciplines. And over time, the idea is that then we can build parity of esteem. It's not something you can magic up overnight because it's a disparity that's deeply rooted in considerations about status and I would say increasingly false assumptions about income, which is to say that a highly qualified electrician can earn just as well as a policy analyst. And I think actually the universities now are not looking like the same proposition that they did half a century ago in terms of the income advantage that they offer. So another part of this to me would actually be much better provision of information to young people about what the prospects are by, say, age 25, if you pursue a university degree in arts or humanities versus maybe undertaking a trade qualification, to let them know the breadth of trade qualifications that are available. But a key part is getting this unique opportunity right. For the first time, the vocational pathways will have proper curricula underpinning them, which are to be developed by the industry skills boards. It will be really important to resource them properly to do it really well, and to make it at least look like a level playing field at the outset, which NCA failed to do.
Thank you. Just a reminder to everyone on the webinar that we can take questions. So if you could submit them through the Q&A panel piece on the actual Zoom. Now we go to round 2 choices, and a question here for Tim and Jon. You both land on the Commerce Commission and the limits of our competition settings, though you're approaching this from different angles. Tim, you've argued that the Commission needs the power to enforce structural remedies directly. And Jon, you make the case for expanding market reform. So market study powers and also building the capacity to recommend ambitious reform while sustaining political commitment to carry it through. If each of you had to nominate a single change that would do the most to rebalance power to consumers, what would it be and what stands in the way? Who wants to go first?
I can go first if you want. I don't think the source of disagreement is with whether industry studies are important. I actually agree that it's very important for the Commerce Commission to embark and to constantly analyze the industries that they're looking at, because industry outcomes are very different. Solutions to poor competition is often very industry specific. So you have to really understand the nature of the industry that you're looking at in order to come up with a set of viable solutions to anti-competitive practices. Where I think we might disagree is that I think that the Commerce Commission has had one hand tied behind its back for a long time. It has been relatively ineffective because it doesn't have the resources in some cases, it doesn't have the mandate, the legislative discretion to do the sorts of things that similar organizations in other countries routinely do. For example, to break up industries, to break up firms that tend to dominate a particular industry. There are lots of solutions that we have that are available to a Commerce Commission to make industries function more competitively. The market is the solution in a sense. It's just that we haven't had the competitive forces arise in a number of our markets, and we could do a lot more as a Commerce Commission to increase that competitive outcome. So I think the markets are the solution. It's just that the Commerce Commission has been relatively weak in pushing those competitive forces and taking the kind of remedial actions that are very common in other countries.
Jon?
Look, I don't actually think we're disagreeing at all. We've got vigorous agreement. My point really is that before we get to a regulator, and that could very well be the Commerce Commission having the powers to implement structural interventions, we need to have the evidence base, and in order to put forward ambitious recommendations that should involve what are in some instances quite extreme interventions, the entity that is empowered to do the market study needs to have both the ambition and the support to gather its evidence and make recommendations along those lines. At the moment, we see a lack of ambition. We see quite timid recommendations. I mean, we haven't seen a market study initiated since the banking market study was completed, which was started under the previous government. So, I mean, a bigger question needs to be asked, I think, even under our current regime where market studies aren't necessarily producing the bold recommendations that we need to implement the changes and the challenges we need to entrenched market power. Why are we not seeing more market studies? I mean, it appears to me that the capability of the Commerce Commission has been depowered in this area. We're certainly not seeing requests come through from government to do market studies. And the question has to be asked, is this because they raise awkward questions that involve politicians having to make hard decisions at the moment?
Mm.
So hopefully that answers the question. I don't think Tim and I are in disagreement on this.
I'd like you both to stay on that point because as a journalist, I've obviously observed a lot of jawboning and feathers fluffing about particular industries which are seen to playing too much market power to the expense of consumers. So how do we get past this political bottleneck? But you make the very point, I mean, we've had banking studies, very little of worth actually ends up being implemented. So how do you change the debate so political power is appropriately addressed as well?
I can jump on that quickly and pass
Sure.
to you, Tim, if you want. I mean,
Go ahead.
I think that's right. I mean, that there is a common theme running through this book, that is, we need bipartisan agreement, cross-party consensus on what needs to be done. I think we've lost our way. We've forgotten a little bit that some of the points that Tim made around really strong interventions in markets. I think, it was only the 1970s where, the Americans stepped in and broke up IBM, opened up platforms that, the strong interventions in markets is not an anathema to, a market-led economy. It actually enables it. And I think politically, whether politicians have been captured by orthodox thought or vested interests, we're not seeing the willingness to challenge entrenched markets that we should, and for the public benefit.
Do you want to add to that?
Sure. I mean, I'll just jump on the same theme. Is in the end, it's all about politics. The political message has to come through that for a small open economy, competition is critical in our various markets and industries. We have to do something to try to improve the competitiveness of what we do. And the message has to come from the government that the Commerce Commission has to be bolder, more decisive, take the actions that are necessary in order to improve those competitive outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just moving along to Matt and Toby, and a common idea runs through your chapters, and that's better outcomes depend less on one particular policy than on the quality and independence of the institutions making the calls. And Matt, you've argued that's an independent fiscal institution. And for you, Toby, it's deliberate, transparent industrial policy with robust evaluation built in. How do we actually build that institutional discipline in a system geared to 3-year cycles? And what stops a future government simply unwinding it the moment it becomes inconvenient? Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in. That's a good question. I mean, just look at the Productivity Commission, right? We can immediately see that once it was deemed to be politicized by one part of the political spectrum, it all sort of unwound. And that was a powerful, important institution that did great work, that was highly respected overseas, and was a mistake for New Zealand to get rid of, to be completely frank. But when we think about the design of these types of institutions, politicians are responding to incentives. So when we see them responding to the fact that they're worried about intervening in some way, or they're worried about talking about a certain problem, it's because they're thinking about their political cycle, and they're thinking about what they face. An independent fiscal institution is about creating the information environment that changes those incentives. So there needs to be bipartisan agreement on the scope of such an organization, and then public buy-in to valuing that information. And the New Zealand Public Service, above most other public services, was filling that role, but it is so close to ministers. And I would argue that it will become more politicized, or maybe even is starting to, even if, as New Zealanders, we don't want to admit it. And for that reason, we need an institution where there's public buy-in, that information is valuable, and it gets out there and it expresses those views. Can we stop governments unwinding it? No. But that's you can only start.
Toby?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think these issues of long-term governance and long-term policy making are really critical when it comes to industrial policy. My colleague at Victoria University, Jonathan Boston's written a lot about this challenge, and when I put that in the context of this policy area, any success that we have in terms of industrial strategy, interventionist industrial policy is going to be showing success over a very long run, whether that's technologies that aren't fully developed yet, whether that's a new industry that's getting off the ground. These are multi-decade sort of enterprises. And so that is really challenging in terms of making sure that we're showing those successes in the early stages. The other thing, and Matt's alluded to this as well, is that governments in recent times have faced really, really tight fiscal situations. And when you're in that setting, anything that you're not sure is delivering value is naturally going to be in line for people to try and reprioritize that money elsewhere. So what you often tend to get is an industrial policy that's kind of defined by, entrenched forms of support that people find difficult to take away. Things like the film subsidy program that multiple governments have kind of stuck with. In terms of how we entrench these sort of institutional settings, I think there's a couple of things. One, even though there has been a lot of inconsistency in terms of particular policies, if you look at where successive governments have looked in terms of what's important in terms of policy areas, there is actually a lot of commonality there. If you go back to the business growth agenda we saw during the Key government, you compare that to what we saw in some of the economic strategies under Jacinda Ardern or Chris Hipkins, they're talking about very broad areas where we haven't seen consistency as the policies that are put in place to try and target those. And the other thing I point out here that is really important is we just need to be clear about how we judge the success of these sorts of policies. If we are deciding that we're going to support some new enterprises, the failure of one particular project or one particular firm does not disprove that model. If government is getting involved in this space and we're seeing a zero failure rate, it's probably a good indication that we weren't adding that much value in the first place. But there has tended to be this very high level of risk aversion in terms of what we're committing to and perhaps an overreaction to singular failures.
Just a follow-up question on that. Can we afford not to do industrial policy given that US, China and Europe are so heavily engaged now for their flagship companies?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think we've seen, particularly under the Biden administration, a much more explicit focus on industrial policy, a much more explicit focus on the industries that America wants to dominate relative to China. And, I was working as an advisor in the Ardern government during a lot of that period. And, a lot of what people like Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor under Biden, were talking about was very, very similar to some of the thinking that was going on in that government. What was different was that a lot of that was phrased in terms of US-China tension, which is obviously a very difficult environment for New Zealand to have to navigate. But I don't think we have any choice but to try to navigate that space.
And Matt, just coming back to the independent fiscal institution, the late John Zorab and Ian Ball, former Treasury leader at the Public Finance Act Turns 30 conference, and this is some years ago now, had a real focus on this and the necessity for it. Why do you think these very sound proposals just can't get purchased?
I think a really key thing about New Zealand is that the public sector has been filling a lot of this role. I don't think people realize how objective the public sector is in New Zealand compared to other countries, how much technical information and work are provided by the public sector. And how much independent advice is put publicly. What's it called? Radical transparency is what people in Australia call what New Zealand does with policy advice. And that's reduced the need for it. But there's, in terms of getting influence into the public, in terms of there truly being independence, in terms of pushback when sometimes, a policy analyst, myself when I was in these shoes many years ago, would feel pressure to be careful with the numbers because assessing my own risk. An independent institution that doesn't face that will give better advice. So there's still an improvement, but it was because we were in a good space. There wasn't the need at the time.
Okay, thanks so much for that. Finally, Michael, several of your recommendations are genuine parity for industry-led subjects, credible and respected vocational pathway. These take years to bed in, arguably longer than a single parliamentary term. You argue that productivity growth is long anemic in New Zealand, and this depends on a skilled and innovative workforce. How do we hold a steady course on this through changes of government? And is there a moment in the next few years, as these new qualifications are designed, where this could either be locked in or lost?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, I think this, of all the topics we're discussing here today, has the most scope for bipartisanship. There should be very little disagreement that we need to do something to improve the pathways from school into industry and trades training. I mean, for example, we could compare ourselves with countries like Germany and Switzerland, who have gold standard systems for this. 50% of German school leavers go straight into apprenticeships, compared with, as you mentioned before, France, 6% here. So that should be a clear signal that this is an important thing to get right. And it should be more about how we build up the esteem and resourcing of that system over time. I mean, another thing that's worth mentioning in relation to Germany is that their companies all belong to chambers of commerce to whom they pay a compulsory levy that is used to fund the institutional component of industry and trades training. Now, the reason that they're happy to do that without complaint is because they know they get really high quality employees out of that system. New Zealand employers at the moment probably might be loath to pay such a levy, but if we can start to demonstrate value, then that starts to build the case for them paying some kind of contribution towards training. And I would say that if we get the industry-led subjects at secondary level right, they will start to build that case, because if employers know that when they take on an apprenticeship who has got those subjects, they're going to be well prepared, they're going to be productive earlier. No apprentices are straight away, but they'll start to earn their keep earlier on. And that when they graduate with a qualification, they'll be a really good employee. Then we can start to build up that. And of course, there's a whole raft of issues with the politics, which were te Pūkenga for a while. They're in a parlous financial state. So that's another area that's beyond the scope of my chapter that needs serious attention to build this up to be what we need it to be.
Thank you. We'll now turn to questions from online. First one from Kushlan. It says, our exports as a percentage of GDP is one of the lowest in the OECD. As a small country, don't we need another prong to our economy than just agriculture, and a better resourced industrial policy similar to what the last Labour government had? Who wants to take that one up on industrial policy?
I'm happy to jump in there. Yeah, I think that's an important point. Successive governments have talked about growing our exports. While they've grown in absolute terms, obviously it has been really difficult for New Zealand to sort of create those new sort of particularly higher value industries that are successful exporters. One area I would highlight as being particularly important is what's often called the wageless economy. So our creative sector, our digital sector, and so on. I think this is important for two reasons. One, because we are distant from the rest of the world. Anything that we need to ship to other markets is going to be a bit more challenging for us in terms of the carbon emissions that are unavoidable in that process. But the more we can be specializing in kind of knowledge-intensive industries that don't require sort of physical freight, then I think that's building on New Zealand's strengths in a really useful way. The other thing I'd add is we've seen in recent times that the global trading system can break down quite suddenly and quite significantly. And as a country that is very much on the end of the supply chain, I think the more we can be building our resilience through exporting things through digital channels and building industries around that, the better we're going to be able to ride out what might be some of those unfortunate but unavoidable future disruptions to global supply chains.
Would anyone else like to comment on this? Okay, moving along, a question from Krish. Can you give an example of a country's ComCom or similar that does an effective job, why it could be, and could we emulate it? And that's possibly Tim and Jon. Yep.
I mean, I don't have any particular examples off the top of my head, but I would look to some of the European countries, Ireland in particular, look to what Australia is doing, but a broad overview of what's done in the developed world would be really useful. I mean, we are unusual in the sense that we are a relatively small developed economy. So it's particularly important for us and particularly difficult for us to maintain competitive forces across all of our industries. But there are a lot of examples out there of very successful practice in this area.
Jon, do you want to jump in? Yep.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and probably go, let's learn from history. I mean, the Sherman Act broke up Standard Oil and the railway companies. Again, I mentioned activities by the FCC in the 1970s, opening up AT&T's network to competitors and leading to a flourishing of commerce. I mean, at the risk of engaging in intellectual rhetoric and bullshit, I don't want to kind of underplay how important competition policy is for everyday New Zealanders. And I've picked up some comments there in the chat that perhaps this panel is somehow divorced from what's happening on the coal face of New Zealanders engaging with our businesses. 1 in 5 New Zealanders struggled to put food on the table last year because they couldn't afford the prices that are being charged at the supermarkets. 1 in 4 New Zealanders struggled to pay their power bill in the 12 months to April. That's how serious this is. That is a quarter of our population struggling to pay their power bill. And I apologize if talking about competition policy is somewhat intellectual, but that's how we get real change. We debate these issues, and hopefully that has an influence. So that would be my take on it.
I think Suzanne Chetwin has cut to the chase here. How much do you think lobbying by large and influential business groups is affecting government decision-making? And clearly this draws on the ComCom comments, but I put it to you all more broadly because I think the question goes broader than that. A view from you all, please, just quickly around the panel. Starting with you, Michael.
Well, I'm not an economist, so I don't have a great deal to say, but on behalf of my economist colleagues, what they might say about the supermarket situation is that we should look at barriers to entry as well as, potential competition problems. So it's quite hard to build a new supermarket. There's pretty limited space in which you're allowed to do it due to zoning issues. And so if we could have some more competition, that may help too. In terms of new entrants.
Anyone else for a strong view on this? Lobbying, influence.
I was going to say I'm an economist, not a political scientist, so I don't know what I could add as an economist. Yeah, I'll pass it on to another academic discipline. But it is definitely a concern, especially in the area of competition policy, because there are very clear losers if industries are forced to go through a major transformation, potentially breaking up dominant firms. So I would imagine that lobbying is exceedingly important.
Okay. All right. And I think we can say it's not just supermarkets. We can look at the debate around the electricity sector also at the moment.
Oh, yeah.
This is not going to go away. Just moving along, Alison Dobby, the industrial policy, would it actually help New Zealand deal with the timber mill and agricultural processing changes, for example, and support regional development? And I guess some of these companies have been squeezed out by rising costs, particularly around power. Who would like to pick that up in terms of industrial policy? How should it actually be fashioned?
That feels like a me question again, Fran. Yeah, look, one thing I point out is really, I think the loss of our industrial base generally is a real concern. I'm personally a little skeptical that markets sort of seamlessly reallocate these resources, and that we're not losing something when a sort of anchor manufacturing entity closes. At the same time, I think it's really difficult to effectively do industrial policy in a reactive way. If you're in a situation where you're facing factories closing down and the prospect of job losses, that really puts you in a situation where there are not great options in front of you in terms of what you do. When I was jotting down notes of some of the other speakers were talking, I think Jon highlighted a couple of areas in the competition space that are really important in terms of supermarket and electricity. And from an industrial policy point of view, I would be talking about the same industries. I think part of the problem we've had is an electricity sector that is not just not particularly competitive in terms of the prices that the people are paying, but an electricity sector that is undermining, the productive economy. That this should be a real strength for New Zealand in terms of our renewable base. The job of the electricity sector should be cheap, reliable, clean electricity that goes to manufacturers and other producers. And instead, we've seen it undermine, a lot of industries across the country.
I have a question from Dylan Joffe, I think. There was a mention around the value of different types of education and outcomes. He comments that having lived in a number of countries, noticed that some with larger innovation, R&D and investment tend to have the teaching and encouragement of building confidence and leadership in education at an earlier stage. And while most countries have some form or another of tall poppy syndrome, argues this building of confidence from a young age seems to build resilience and innovation. And what are your thoughts on things we could be doing differently in our own education system and how to support this through policy, collaboration between businesses, institutions, and public, private, or potentially NGO partnerships? That's very broad. Michael, would you like to take that one up?
Yeah, I'll actually tackle it at a curriculum and teaching level, because one of the things that really builds confidence and the ability to think critically is knowledge. And, I'm on the public record as being a big supporter of Minister Stanford's curriculum reforms. I think it needs to be matched by reforms in teacher education. I don't think the universities have done a good job of that. And one of the reasons is that they've got 50 million different things to do, and teacher education is but one, and not a particularly lucrative or prestigious one for them at that. And so they haven't resourced it well, and they don't prepare teachers well for the classroom. So this is a slightly roundabout way of saying that if we want young people to have strong leadership skills, we have to make sure that they leave school with solid knowledge that they can use as a basis for critical thinking. And that means addressing the issues that we have had for a long time with a weak school curriculum and ineffective teacher education. If we can get those things right, I think we will have much better prospects, both for and from our younger generation.
Does anyone else want to comment on that? Okay, moving on to the next one. A very political statement from Dani. Baby boomers had free education, affordable housing, community investment, quality healthcare, accessible public services when billionaires and corporations paid taxes. Is that true? Okay, who's picking that one up?
Would I be able to jump in on this one?
Yes, you can.
So this is actually a big thing on both sides of the Tasman. The first thing is in Australia and New Zealand, billionaires and corporations definitely do pay taxes. Let's not import US narratives that make no sense.
Right.
So we put that to the side. And then, yeah, baby boomers, they did have free education, affordable housing. The housing was also a lot crapper. They didn't have these cell phones. There has been real income growth since. There are a lot of things, and intergenerational warfare is not something we should really have here. The real issue is not that baby boomers are going and sailing on yachts and then asking everyone else to pay for it. It's that we've got a fiscal system that was geared towards certain growth, expectations on population growth, productivity growth, that isn't occurring. And because of that, to fund what we committed to in the pension system, we now have to have higher tax rates, not right now, but actually on our children. Gen X and millennials whinge and whinge and whinge and whinge, but they're not the victims. If there's going to be a victim, it's actually people that are young now. So when we think about this issue, when we think about what's happening, we need a clear-eyed understanding of what the trade-offs are, how the fiscal system works, and ultimately whether our transfers make sense. And the intergenerational warfare narrative that's popular in the paper and even popular with governments, you saw it in the recent Australian budget, it's not helpful and it takes things far too far.
Can I just add, why do you assume that billionaires paid taxes? My experience, they were very ardent users of tax dodge designer companies and offshore havens. And in New Zealand, when we did have a very high tax rate initially, that came down, but we also had the introduction of broad-based taxation. So I think probably we might just move along on that, because we could actually debate, and I would want to debate it too, and that's not my role. So anyway, Kathleen Logan, Germany has a schooling system that makes decisions on students' futures at a much earlier age, academic versus vocational, which is certainly what Switzerland does as well. New Zealand students deserve to have all options open. Can we approve apprenticeships or subsidise employing school leavers? And can the ITOs be better supported to fill that information gap for young people about the trade-offs between industries and training options and mainstream vocational education?
Yeah. So it's a really good point raised there about the. I mean, Germany splits kids at the age of 10 or 11 into the Hauptschule and the Gymnasium tracks, which are trades track and university track, respectively. I'm certainly not advocating that we do anything like that here. But thinking a little bit beyond my chapter, what I do think is that it's very hard for a middling-sized school to do a great job of both things. And so in the longer term, I think we should be looking to remodel our school system so that the years 7 through 10 become a middle school, which are the same for everybody. But then from years 11 on, the schools might specialize more, so that if you want to, at that point, go towards a university track, you might go to one school, and if you want to go towards an apprenticeship, it would be another. But we do have to fix the parity of esteem problem before we contemplate that, or you'll just get rich poor school problems arising out of that. So I think there is a role for specialization, but not as early as Germany does it. In terms of the provision of information, the ITOs could do that. I would be more inclined to have a systematic approach. We have a wonderful tool in this country called the Integrated Database Infrastructure, which has unit level information on every New Zealander across a huge range of quite detailed measures. That would be sufficient to build a really good model of what various educational tracks tend to lead to. That could be produced in accessible form for teenagers when they're starting to think about their future and their families to have a look at. And I think that's something that the various ministries could collaborate on and provide as a service to all New Zealanders.
Okay. I think this we're getting close to the end, and I think one of these questions is put to Tim, but probably, and I'm not sure whether it shouldn't be Michael really, but as an economist with the New Zealand Initiative policy group, what's your view of the close assignment, and this is from Laneki, alignment of the NZI to the Atlas Network and so-called Frontier Centre for Public Policy, which employed our Deputy Prime Minister David Seymour?
I think I should probably address that one up front. We are indeed affiliated with the Atlas Network, which we think does great work internationally on developing policy. We get no resources or money from them at all. All of our funding comes from our members, and our members are free. You can read about them freely on our website. So, that's a little bit of a conspiracy theory that got some legs last year, but I'd just like to debunk that one.
Thank you. We now go into the closing questions to the panel, and this is a final one to each of you. The through line of the book is that our long problems need durable cross-party solutions that outlast any single government. So in election year, what is the one commitment you would each want to see our major parties agree on, and a single question that you might urge voters to put to candidates out door knocking, perhaps starting with you, Michael?
Yeah, well, it will come as a little surprise to see that I'd like to see much more bipartisan agreement on educational policy. It's terrible for education when things lurch around every electoral cycle. I think a really good vehicle for that would be a policy advisory committee that both parties had members on or could nominate members for, and that developed policy that was, politically acceptable to both parties. I would hate to see us, undo the reforms of the last few years. We have to expect that successive governments will tweak things, and that's reasonable and appropriate. But we need some stability in the education system to be able to deliver the outcomes that young New Zealanders need and our country needs.
Toby?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the last election was on the cost of living. I expect the next election will be on the cost of living. I do just hope we have a broader understanding of what that means. People don't like inflation, but the cost of living is a real challenge for people when they're out of work or when they don't have the bargaining power to make sure that their real wages keep up. So I would hope that voters are talking about, who has a long-term strategy around the creation of jobs. New Zealand has very high labour market participation generally, but internationally we have seen populist politics take hold. I think it is in places where people haven't had access to work that provides them with dignity and security, and I think New Zealand is in a much better place than a lot of those other countries internationally, but I don't think we're immune to the same sorts of trends that we are seeing.
Tim?
Well, I mean, political parties have very short time horizons, and that is a big issue. I guess I don't hold out a lot of hope for bipartisan agreement on a lot of fundamental issues. But what I would suggest that voters do is ask the political parties for a very clear articulation of what the long-term problems are for this country, and a commitment to solutions to those issues.
Okay, thank you. Jon?
Well, it won't be a surprise to say I'd like to see a commitment to more ambitious, or in fact, any market studies by the incoming government. And in terms of what voters, I think, should be putting on candidates is, I guess, calling out their willingness to, on one hand, acknowledge cost of living issues as being important, but their lack of action on real solutions. I think it goes without saying that essential markets play an essential role in the economy, but if competition's not disciplining these markets effectively, everybody but a few in society loses out. And I guess beyond the political rhetoric or the intellectual rhetoric, ask your candidate if they care about the impact of cost of living and what that's doing to everyday New Zealanders, and what tangible steps they plan to fix broken markets that are causing it.
Okay, Matt, final word from you.
So the key thing is, if I was a punter, is I'd want to know what the trade-offs are with policy. And when I hear politicians talking about policy, I just don't really trust them. So that's why I'd want an independent fiscal institution, and I'd want the ability to then understand what the trade-off is and be able to actually have a conversation with them and pressure them towards whatever my values are. As an economist, I don't feel like I'm well placed to actually pick values. I just want them to be transparent.
Okay, over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Fran, for guiding us through that fantastic conversation, and to all of our panelists for sharing your insights both in the book and in the conversation here today. We do love a policy-focused conversation that's powered by your great intellects on the issues that matter to our future, and that's exactly what we got today. So we really appreciate that. Thank you all to our audience as well for joining us and for engaging in the Q&A session. Thanks to our panelists for their nice succinct answers that allowed that to take place. If you'd like to hear more about these ideas, please do check out that link to pre-order the book. And I hope you'll join us next Thursday for the next webinar in this series. Ka kite anō.